Hi everyone, there's so many of you here. Awesome. Hi, I'm Snek, and today we're gonna talk about player hostile design. So first I want to talk about a bit the structure of this talk. First I'm going to talk about who I am, then we'll go over some general definitions for today, and then we'll go over some concrete mechanical examples and also some use cases, and finally for some generalized philosophical abstractions into game design. I had slides for this. Awesome. Philosophy. Okay, hi. I'm Theo, online also known as Snek. I've been using Godot for about 5 years, and I'm currently the technical director at a small indie studio called Polynormal Games. In the past, I've also worked as a game designer at Bip and Bits, and in my free time, I also write visual novels. First, let's talk a bit about what player hostile design even is. Concretely, I want to cover games that are hostile towards the act of play or the act of being played, right? We have some general examples. We got time wasters, soft locks, the withholding of information, the violation of player consent, generally anything that can be used to make the player just not feel comfortable in their own skin. Some examples from my teens that some of you might be familiar with, things like the Impossible Quiz and Kaizo Mario World, stuff like that, right? And specifically today, I want to generalize towards a design philosophy for games. This player hostile design approach is a refusal of polish, with polish as this like sanding down of the experience to make it as frictionless as possible. Player hostile games serve as an invitation and a challenge to the player to be mature and experience their own emotions in full force. This is about games where you have to continually invest active effort to be able to play them. They often feature unintuitive design aspects, and they exist as kind of an antithesis to easily consumable slop. The goals of this talk are kind of numerous and nebulous because there is no one clear singular benefit of player hostile design. It is a set of tools to explore the bounds of our game systems, and they serve to examine the relationship that we as cultural workers have with our audiences. So for me personally, the first intrinsic appeal of player hostile design is the active desire to generate meaningful play experiences. This is what drove me to investigating further into this. And with that, we finally come to some examples and uses. The first game I want to bring up is a game I made called Snuff Puppy Shelter. This is the game that kind of started this entire journey for me. It is a command line interface text adventure, and it started as like a small 2-day game jam project. Some people would describe it as horror, but really for me it is just about both the experiences of transmisogyny and also the feeling of betraying and selling out your own marginalized community. And as you can maybe discern from the title and the general aesthetics, it is disturbing in content and how it plays. And while it did have some brief niche success, it doesn't make me money anymore because of Australian religious fundamentalists. If you're a TERF, please fucking leave. But back on to Snuff Puppy Shelter, what does it do in its concrete mechanics? It uses something akin to keyboard ghosting to interact with a command line. And then it uses verbal abuse to mess with the player when they get commands wrong. It's not actually keyboard ghosting because it's all like a really messed up input function in GDScript, but you know. And backspace also deletes the entire line, which is just like really frustrating, and is also more likely to have to happen because you're more likely to make typos when you type too quickly, based on the previous point. And generally, the narration lines also serve to unease and unnerve the player. And why would I make something like this? Well, it was just like kind of fun and cathartic to work on. Honestly, the hacky input system just emergently led to interesting mechanics, I think, and the subject matter also felt novel to me at the time. This deliberately slowing down of the game and being mean to the player forces him to sit with the content longer, which can engender introspection. And it makes them also sit longer with the, in real life, existing cycles of structural abuse. The restricted gameplay options also restrain self-expression. Games are conventionally framed as power fantasies and not as tools of oppression, but games as cultural artifacts also reinforce cultural attitudes or have the potential to do so. And then in this way, this game can become a critical examination of that. And players that know these cycles and machines of oppression can feel seen and understood, which is nice. Hello? The presenter thing is dead. Furthermore, I do not believe that you can have a serious conversation about the topics of our society if you do anything but the bare maximum. Games as art pieces are always having a conversation with politics, and not leaning into your own ideas as hard as possible is the way of the coward and not the way to heaven. So the first appeal of player-style design is to just grind ideas into players' skulls. For a second example, I want to talk about a paper prototype that we covered at work. At the studio where I worked at, where I currently work at, we started a new project in February, and for that we did some paper prototyping. And as you can see there on the side, the cards were just like bland. They were black text on gray paper, and there's nothing but the raw words to spur the imagination for the emergent roleplay during paper prototyping. And the text in that sense was just the raw mechanics and the card title. And the most fun cards, despite no major differences in the design space they utilized, were the cards Toxic Fury, Situationship, and Crash Out. Being mean to your players is the shortcut to intense emotions. We also had cards like Hug, but they're like stale and boring. Having a meltdown in front of your party is a narrative glue that engenders us as storytelling machines. There's reasons for a meltdown, there's reasons for a follow-up that players can engage with on a mechanical and narrative level. So you can just like use intense wording to actively grab your players' attention. Whenever you have a point of friction with your player in that sense, you can also just like make them admit that they're doing something bad, and then they continue playing potentially, which means that you implicitly gain their consent to go further down that road. I think that is why Spec Ops: The Line also gained such a huge following. Like, despite the fairly standard mechanics, it is a game that confronts you with yourself and invites you to dive deeper into yourself. Right? When you play these cards, there's an implicit story being told, and I would consider this player-hostile design in the sense that you're forcing the player to enter situations that they do not want to be in. The flavor is not fantastical. The flavor is you have mental issues, and that is friction for your players to contend with. So the appeal number 2 of player-hostile design is to heighten emotional stakes and investment. For a third example, I want to cover even more games that I did not work on, and for that I want to start with Proximate and a few others. Proximate, in case you don't know it, it's a horror game and it has a fairly unconventional control scheme. It is under the hood only 2D top-down controls, but you only see what's right in front of you, not visually, but via a text display that gives you a statistical average in-game of what it is that you're likely looking at. And this is a less traditional mechanical progression that also serves as obfuscating the ending point. It is less clear when you're actually steering towards the end of the game if you try to derive it from the mechanics that the game presents to you. And there is nothing that makes your journey easier as the game goes on. There is no skill tree, there's nothing but your own skills, and the game actually makes it harder for you to progress as time goes on. It still does other things to like give you a sense of story progression and your place in it, but the mechanics feel less like going through the motions, which can obfuscate the stakes. You can obfuscate stakes in other ways for the first-time user experience as well. Like now we're going into some very generalized design patterns across games. A general pattern that many games utilize more in a hardcore space is just the concept of one mistake costing you hours of gameplay investment. Like hardcore games like Pathologic or Escape from Tarkov are built on the appeal of such a hardcore experiences. Resources like food and medicine can be scarce in many survival games, and you can sometimes already have lost the game hours before actually having a game over state, just because sometimes the virtual distance that you have left in your hunger bar is less than the distance that you need to get to the next refreshment point. On a meta level, we also get to something like unskippable cutscenes, which add a real-time investment and punishment to every fail state that sometimes is not even the player's fault if you introduce randomness, which can introduce even more frustration. So the appeal number 3 of player-hostile design is to build tension. A fourth example for today would be Cruelty Squad. For those that don't know, Cruelty Squad is a game that looks like this. It's a first-person shooter. It's pretty difficult, but we're taking in the vibe. And I think Cruelty Squad does a great job at alienating the player. It alienates the player by just putting it into its world. All games do this, right? They take the player from their real-life context and put them into the context of the game world. But Cruelty Squad, I think, is special in that the horribleness it is filled with is just very analogous to real life. You have just an arbitrary stock market, you have a complete devaluing of human life, you have nonsensical user interfaces, and I believe these are all highly contemporary topics that wouldn't hit us hard with a more conventional and frictionless presentation style. Cruelty Squad is a game that will make you uncomfortable through eye strain, its sound design, its jarring dialogue, and the normalization of cruelty. Like I mentioned earlier, how you gain the player's consent to continue, and here you also condition them to trade organs on the stock market. And now we get to the general psychological patterns of comfort and discomfort, because when you're discomforted, you want to move to a place of comfort generally. And both materially and the concrete game mechanics and psychologically, we can ask ourselves the questions of what is that place of comfort? How do you get there? Why do you want to get there? And once the player has reached that place of comfort, you can try and fuck with that too. If you don't do that, then you just introduce safe rooms. If you do mess with that, then you can add surprise or a false sense of security. And in some cases, when it gets really stressful, you can whittle players down to their base instincts, their most primal reactions. And once they're in such a vulnerable state, you can easily touch their brains with the ideas and concepts from your game. To employ a contrast that we are accustomed to outside of gaming creates discomfort, because we are so conditioned to discomfort in real life. Like people and systems that don't respect your time, we have that in real life. We have bullshit jobs, we have healthcare waiting lists. The entire healthcare system is a massive system that does not take your bodily autonomy seriously. And Cruelty Squad is that logic applied to a game, and that makes it hostile. To employ player-hostile design in this context means to just experience the horrible things of real life. And why would this be good? Well, it can also test the moral compass. It makes them emphasize with things outside of their lived reality. And if you're a conformist, then I guess good job, you have no depth to your beliefs. So the fourth appeal of player-hostile design can be to alienate and discomfort. On the topic of alienation and discomfort, I also want to talk about noise. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I hope it'll be apparent soon. We're going to talk about some really smart artsy games online now. We get games like write emails at work, where you have to type out every single letter of your work emails, and you have to physically spend time with the words being said. In some email chains, characters give each other book recommendations for books that actually exist, and then you physically retread the character's argumentation, and it takes forever. And it can also make you reflect on the bullshit jobs we have in real life, where you maybe manually type out emails and texts at your job, and this game can make it maybe less or more fun. And then, why would that be? Well, because of capitalism and monetary incentives. We get to games like Through the Gaps Between My Fingers, where you're dropped into the world with basically no direction. And in real life, our game design world, or the conventional mainstream game design world, is inundated with fixed and variable reward schedules, and a colorful aesthetic journey with no clear goal can be highly meditative, even if disorienting. A game like Lost in Some Noise is basically just an actively nauseating and unnavigable 3D art installation, like this moves in the game. And that is what new art is made of. It is an exploration of extremes, of novel ways of creating and talking to your audience via the medium of video games. Now we get to a bit of a plot twist. These are games from a series of jams that I co-host. There's one not coming soon, you can register, hey. But these have seen some really cool entries in the past. They have been a massive grow bed for novel designs ideas from so many different people, because I myself also have just a profound fascination with noise and texture. You have TV static, JPEG compression, and erosion of senses, of gameplay, a degradation of media, and I believe an underlying motivation for this fascination can be summed up by the following quote. It is never enough to keep multiplying forms of invention. One must also produce new genres within which to generate new forms. Noise becomes generic as the form of invention with which obliged to substitute the abstract negation for genre for the production of hitherto unknown genres. Philosopher Ray Brazé in an essay, or put more simply, to make new things, you first have to create the space in which those things can exist. I believe that is the core appeal of player-hostile design. You create a space in which you unlock the educated and informed use of novel design patterns. And here we get to the part we can learn about us and ourselves as designers and our designs. Through player-hostile design, we can learn how far we can and should go. Perhaps it can seem superfluous to make games that are horrible to play. But we are game makers. We want to hone our craft and understand our tools. Understanding the extremes is a way of understanding where you want to go on the entire scale, which tools you can employ and how. This is all informed by a self-conception as artists. I believe that we have like a moral imperative to be aware of how we can hurt our audiences and then use that knowledge to hurt them in ways that we actively intend to do. Making Snuff Puppy Shelter once taught me more about how far you can go with any destruction of game interaction than any more conventional project. Someone that denies being capable of evil is much more dangerous than someone who accepts their capacity to do so. I believe that considering the pain that we inflict on others makes us more empathetic as humans and better as game makers. Player-hostile design makes us grapple with the mechanics that we use to be hostile or friendly towards our players, and then we can just make better design decisions. And exploring all of these mechanics teaches us what mechanics mean in the context of our games as experiential artifacts. All right, that's it. Thank you all for listening. We have time for Q&A now. Should I go? Or like...
Hi, thank you for the talk. Great stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah, it reminds me of that like push and pull you want in game design generally. But I was wondering, you instill this uncomfortable situation, and I immediately started thinking, okay, so how do I keep the player hooked? That would probably be like reward their pain and make them like trust that their pain will be rewarded. But I'm then thinking, what's your look on that?
Yeah, I mean, we get to different levels of that question, I believe. All different players have just different tolerances for frustration, for pain, stuff like that. And yeah, there is a point to be made that you need to give the player a feeling of safety. I personally, I'm fairly open towards like experiences like that, but generally it is good to show the player in like a more low stakes context that you as a game designer or game writer are capable of handling big emotions, complex topics in like smaller, less harmful contexts. And then you can keep increasing the stakes as the game progresses. And that can be a way of just gaining the player's trust. This works especially well if you have like an established audience or a prior body of work where you're already displaying a capacity to like handle emotions well. And yeah, like some players also just like play games to get hurt. Like players as humans have different levels of masochism in them, and yeah, you just have to kind of set like the cutoff or like where you want to sit in like, okay, this is the level of being mentally kind of fucked up that I'm taking you and we're going someplace else, and that is something that you have to decide what fits well with like the general goal of your game. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, it does, and I also believe not every game is for everyone. Otherwise,
yeah, absolutely,
you would get a very boring game.
There's more questions.
So how do you counterbalance this analysis, this motion, this type of games with the other strong current that I see, which is cozy games, kind of the exact opposite in a way, right?
I wouldn't say if counter is like the correct framing. Cozy games are just like a different niche. They can have some overlapping design spaces, but yeah, like there's just like different target audiences. I think. I mean, now we entered like the big rant of like cozy games aren't actually that cozy because many of them have like a grand strategy game somewhere in them, but. Like, oh my god, the Stardew Valley is so stressful. Like, what do you mean I need a daily schedule? But yeah, I think that they're just like very different schools of design. I personally don't really enjoy cozy games that much because they don't give me like, they don't do to my emotions what I want art to do to my emotions. Yeah, so generally, kind of riffing on the previous answer question thing, not all games are for everyone, and it's okay to have different design goals.
Wonderful talk, thank you. You talked a bit about responsibility and like using these powers in a constructive way. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what it looks like when somebody is doing this irresponsibly?
Sorry, could you repeat the last part of the question? I didn't hear it. Could
you talk a little bit about what it looks like when someone is doing this kind of game design irresponsibly?
Mm-hmm. I received a similar question before, and it's difficult to think of examples that are like very high profile in that sense, because there's also different versions of acting irresponsibly. I think, especially if we're talking about game mechanics, then an irresponsible use of game mechanics can be just games that do not give you like the tools or the direction of how you can cope with the emotions that they instill in you. like there's many games that have ideas baked into their mechanics that are very unreflected, especially around both the topics of cis heteronormativity and colonialism, both in like the dating sim and grand strategy genres respectively. But there's no singular concrete game that I would say is using, or like nothing that comes to mind at least off the top of my head where I would say, oh yeah, they're doing this badly. I tend to focus on art where I can extract something good from them, and then I don't have the time really to seek out many negative examples. Sorry.
That's fair.
Hi there. Excellent talk.
Thank you.
Curious about something. Have you ever experimented with customizability of something like difficulty levels? I really like the concept of actually structuring and identifying the different mechanics that are player hostile, that engender these discomforts and things. Have you ever experimented with customizability on turning some of those off and on, such as, essentially like lowering the difficulty level for some players, or do you consider that to be antithetical to player hostile design?
It depends. I mean, generally customizability and accessibility, I think always struggle, not negatively, but like they have this inherent tension of like, when do you begin undermining your game's essence? I think that is something that you have to decide for yourself as designer and identify which mechanics are there to like kind of add spice and flavoring, and which is like the core that you don't want players to touch. I think that like using more emergent difficulty levels can be fun, but that's not really the core of the question. I think it also falls into the, what do you want your game to be? Do you want it to be this one set bar that people have to clear? Or do you want it to be more about the experience that people can modularize for themselves, but that also has like repercussions for your production schedule and what you actually need to accommodate in your game design? So like this big topic.
Fair. Personal philosophy, though? Would you allow different difficulty levels?
Personal philosophy is generally make games as like baseline accessible as possible. I generally don't do much in terms of difficulty settings because I'd much rather have like one precise artistic vision that I cater towards.
Gotcha.
And if something is not for someone, then it's fine.
Awesome, thank you.
Hello?
Hi.
Really cool talk. Good job. Excuse me. I understand this didn't come off as a bit of a subjective question, but like a lot of how when players, excuse me, like sorry, it's very hard to speak, but also hear your own voice at the same time.
Yeah, I struggled with that so hard in the beginning. Fuck this.
Yeah, sorry. But like a lot of how when players initially get into the game in the first place, there's this hook or this sort of connection that leaves them staying. How important is that to the overall experience? And like, especially from my personal experience, like growing up with rage games, like how important is like fucking hell, it's so difficult. Yeah, I know.
Plug your ears.
Yeah, actually, let me try that.
You can also just
Like how important
normally,
is the initial hook that retains the player throughout the entire experience? How often should you pull your punches throughout the game so that like the players don't get too annoyed or too comfortable? And how important is what's the difference between someone who's very experienced with games playing these kind of experiences compared to someone who isn't very used to video games? Like how Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Okay, so starting at the end, experience is a thing that you can leverage or not. That depends on how your game mechanics are structured. Many first-time gamers or people that haven't played any games at all struggle with first-person camera controls actually, and that is something many game designers don't facilitate, and then those get labeled as casual. So like that's a different question, really. I think I generally don't like to pull my punches. I think it's more impactful if you just have the world exist and then you go, hey, by the way, there's this twist now, and then you slap the player in the face. I generally try to have a hook that's very like simple and strong in the beginning, so that I can confront the player with a bunch of bullshit and challenge them to be like, hey, you saw a cool thing at the beginning. You want to see more of that, right? And that is kind of how you can retain players even across hostile mechanics, because they need to have some motivation to go there. And I think aesthetic presentation and also like polish on a like micro mechanical scale can go a long way there, even if I flagged across like against like polish in the beginning, but like, you know, there's different levels of polish.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank God I managed to say the question. Who wants it? Oh, yeah.
Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I like the concept of exploring different emotions that we're not used to in video games that are maybe present in other forms of art. Do you think there's something we should go next? I mean, I understand. I really like this concept, and I also I'm familiar with a lot of concepts, with a lot of games that make me feel uncomfortable. But I'm thinking about a lot of movies that also make me feel disgust, and of course, fear is very much explored. Or what do you think on that spectrum?
Yeah, definitely. I think what we are currently seeing worldwide is just like a massive fascistic retaliation against games that engender those emotions. Like Doki Doki Literature Club was like delisted from the Google Play Store a few days ago after like being on there for 10 years, because suddenly it's like too intense in how it tackles sensitive themes. And I often think about why that is. Like, there's many like incredibly gruesome, commercially viable like horror films that come out and horror series. But then even just like fairly like comparatively tame games like Horses don't even land on like Steam. It might be also just because of how like comparatively young the games industry is. Like, it was born in like the 80s out of like Silicon Valley tech entrepreneur bullshit. So it inherits a lot of like the values from that, which currently is techno-fascism. And yeah, I definitely want, I mean, also in my personal body of work, I definitely strive for like more transgressive games and emotion, and like games that tackle emotions in ways that are not trivial, because I think there's also like a lot of joy in life to be gained from experiencing more intense and complicated emotions, but that requires a certain level of emotional maturity from the audience that is often just not engendered anymore. Also, with the rise of short-form content, just the act of consuming a larger chunk of media and then sitting with it is just falling out of fashion, as is like the rise of live service games contributing to that. So I mean, yeah, I'm on the side of like weird, disgusting art house films and games, and I wish there was more of like economical leverage and also less of a constant political threat. Like we're seeing, especially queer game makers get debanked if they make like even vaguely adult content online, just like sex workers are all the time, and it sucks.
All right, thank you. Can you pass down there?
One sec. Up there.
Hi. So I'm not sure if I can formulate it as a question, but I was thinking of like those hostile game mechanics, and one of them that appears in a lot of games like involuntarily, I think, is travel time. So especially with games that are longer, you at some point have to travel more. And it's not always made a point. It's just like, I think in game design, that is when the discussion comes up, do we introduce fast travel or not? So I guess there's this thing with like reducing friction, and it could be leveraged, but it could also be annoying. And I know of players that like hate when they like feel like their time is wasted. So there's like this consideration, like when should we do something like that is easy to access, or like when should we make it deliberately difficult? And like with travel time, there's like, I think it's a really cool mechanic to explore, because like, for example, in Disco Elysium, you are running all the time. You can walk, but you will probably not, and the game will have a way to incorporate why you're running all the time. But it's kind of like walking speed in a game where you move is a huge issue, and you don't make a game where you're moving at the speed that you actually would. Like maybe if you are very, very sporty, then you could pull that off. So I'm wondering, that is what I meant with, I'm not sure if I can formulate a question. It's a kind of like this I guess it's where do you draw a line when to make it convenient for a player, and when do you make it inconvenient? And do you, in your like progress, when you're not making a game that is focused on being challenging, consider these kind of pain points?
Yeah, I think general open world design can fall onto like a range of scales in that sense. Like it doesn't have to be hostile. It can generally be like somewhat player hostile. It would just be like, you know, waste the time walking through like a world that kind of sucks, and where there's nothing to do. But it doesn't have to be. I mean, if you want to make like a really chill and cozy experience, I think Sable would be a great example, because I never once fast traveled in that game, and there's kind of nothing to do in that world in between points of interest, but it's just like a really pretty game to look at. And yeah, I mean, there's generally the issue of fast travel invalidating the concept of an open world. So I think learning to compensate for that is more interesting. Like you can make the act of just walking around hostile towards the player. There's absolutely mechanical ways of doing that. I just think that's like a case-by-case decision on like what you want the general game world to feel. Something like random encounters, especially how many like older JRPGs do it. I think that's like one of the most frustrating and annoying design patterns that has ever graced the face of this forsaken earth. And it's a staple for some reason. And yeah, like if you believe that you have a good design pattern on your hand, on your paws, you can just like use it and then see where it goes. I think there's ways of making open world travel hostile and non-hostile towards the player, and what you want to do is kind of dependent on what you want the game generally to feel. All right, that was it. You can come to me with questions afterwards. Thank you all for watching.